The rotor blades chopped the morning air like a buzzsaw over calm water as a bright orange Coast Guard helicopter hovered just above my private dock ready to descend. Then suddenly, without warning, it veered hard left, climbing back into the sky like something spooked it. Confused, I stepped out onto my porch with my coffee, only to see a freshly nailed wooden board where the official emergency marker used to be. In big red letters it screamed, "No trespassing, HOA property." My jaw dropped. I hadn't put it there. And I sure didn't authorize anyone to touch my dock, which had been cleared as an emergency Coast Guard landing zone for over a decade. That's when I noticed her standing on the shoreline, waving smugly, with a hammer in one hand and a cup of herbal tea in the other. Karen from the HOA. Of course it was her. She mouthed the words "you're welcome" like she'd just solved world peace. She had no idea she had just committed a federal offense. The day had started like any other peaceful lakeside morning. Birds chirped, the sky was glass smooth, and the air carried that early dew scent that made the porch feel like a sanctuary. I had a fresh pot of coffee brewing and a plan to finish some remote work before taking my boat out. My dock wasn't just a nice convenience, it was essential. Not just for me but for the Coast Guard as well. After a regional flood years ago, FEMA and DHS coordinated with a few private property owners like me to designate strategic zones for water rescue and helicopter landings. My dock was one of those. I'd worked with federal engineers to reinforce it, add the exact steel grating they required, and ensure it was GPS registered and coded for rapid identification. That dock wasn't just wood and bolt. It was a critical safety point. So seeing that ridiculous sign hammered into one of the pylons made my blood boil. I walked down the path, boots crunching on gravel, half hoping I was wrong. Maybe some kids played a prank. But no. As I got closer, I saw the laminated HOA logo stapled to the bottom with Karen's signature next to it in Sharpie. Underneath it read, "Unauthorized dock activity subject to fines." My brain couldn't decide whether to scream or laugh. Then I heard her high-pitched voice behind me say I did what had to be done. You can't just let anyone use community land. I turned slowly, and she was there in full yoga gear, sun hat balanced like a crown of entitlement, and a little clipboard in her hand. Karen had recently been elected HOA president, mostly because she out-talked everyone else and promised to plant more lavender bushes. Since then, she'd made it her personal mission to audit every inch of the neighborhood for what she called non-conforming structures. She'd already banned porch swings longer than 5 feet, declared someone's vintage bicycle rack a hazard, and now apparently decided my dock needed her royal input. I told her as calmly as I could, "Karen, this dock is not HOA land. It's private. And more importantly, it's federally registered. It's a Coast Guard access point. You just interfered with a federal system." She scoffed and said, "Oh please. You expect me to believe that little fishing plank is a government facility? Is James Bond coming to visit too? It would have been funny if it wasn't so dangerous." I explained again, showing her the laminated sticker from DHS and Coast Guard that was previously mounted near the tip, now ripped off. I even pulled out a printed copy of the Memorandum of Understanding I had with the Emergency Services team. She rolled her eyes and said, "Looks Photoshop. Maybe next time use better font." I knew then logic wouldn't work. Karen wasn't interested in the truth. She was interested in control. So I decided to call someone who could shut her down for me. I stepped back into the house and made the call to Commander Nolan at the Regional Coast Guard office. He didn't hesitate. He said they'd be sending a team over that afternoon to assess the damage and respond appropriately. When I told him about the unauthorized sign and the aborted landing that morning, his voice went ice cold. By mid-afternoon, 2 Coast Guard officers in uniform showed up at my property with clipboards, radios, and expressions that said they were not in the mood for HOA drama. I greeted them at the gate and walked them down to the dock, where Karen was still lounging in a lawn chair, sun hat tilted back like she owned the place. When she saw the officers, her expression turned from smug to startled, but she recovered quickly, saying, "Good afternoon, gentlemen. I trust you're here to support our efforts to maintain community safety." The taller officer didn't even blink. "Ma'am, did you post this sign?" She replied, "Why, yes. I'm the HOA president. This area isn't suitable for unsupervised public use." He looked at her and said, "This dock is a federally designated emergency access site. Your sign caused a chopper to abort landing during a scheduled exercise. That's a serious violation." Karen tried to laugh it off, saying, "Well, I wasn't told anything about that. Shouldn't there be paperwork or permits or something?" I handed the officer the exact documentation she ignored earlier. He looked through it, nodded, and took photos of the sign. Then he radioed back with a brief update. Within 10 minutes, a small patrol boat docked, and another officer joined them. Karen was now pacing in place, asking if she was being arrested, which no one had said, but she seemed to expect it. They didn't arrest her. Not yet. But they did issue a written warning and instructed her to remove all unauthorized signage immediately. She refused. She actually said, "I'll have my lawyer cousin review this. He knows municipal law." The officer didn't argue. They simply informed her that any further interference would trigger obstruction charges under federal code and possibly Homeland Security jurisdiction, depending on incident severity. Karen's face went pale, and for the first time she didn't have a comeback. They removed the sign themselves, documenting the removal and reattaching the Coast Guard marker where it belonged. They even added a QR sticker that linked directly to the Federal Registry of Emergency Landing Site. Karen stood there fuming but silent. After the officers left, she stormed up to me and said, "You think this is over? I run this neighborhood, and you'll regret undermining me." I didn't respond. I just walked up the dock, checking that the emergency markings were all secured. But in the back of my mind, I had a feeling this wasn't over. Karen wasn't the type to learn lessons. She was the type to double down. And I wasn't just going to need backup. I was going to need proof, cameras, community witnesses, and maybe even legal firepower. Because when HOA Karens declare war, they don't just trespass. They rewrite the rules and nail them to your property like medieval tyrants. What she didn't know was that the Coast Guard wasn't just mildly annoyed. They were escalating this to internal legal teams. And I was just getting started too. This was no longer about a dock. It was about the line between power and accountability. And Karen was about to find out exactly what happens when you try to block a federal lifeline with a $10 wooden sign and a yoga mat. The silence that followed Karen's failed confrontation with the Coast Guard didn't last long. The very next morning, a typed letter was slipped under my door, a special HOA notice with her signature at the bottom, still written in that loopy cursive like it was a wedding invitation. It declared that an emergency board meeting had been called to vote on the unauthorized occupation and alteration of shared community infrastructure. She had the nerve to refer to my dock, my private, legally documented, federally registered dock, as if it were part of the HOA's pool patio. And the best part? The meeting was being held in the clubhouse at 10 a.m. that same day, a time she likely assumed I wouldn't be available since she always called meetings while I was either working or out assisting with Coast Guard drills. But today I was ready. When I walked into the clubhouse, the air shifted. Half the board members avoided eye contact. A few residents looked confused, clearly not in on the plan. Karen was already standing at the front of the room next to a dry erase board labeled Community Dock Issues, with a bunch of fake bullet points underneath it. She beamed when she saw me and said in the most condescending voice possible, "Oh, there he is. Glad you could join us. We were just discussing public safety concerns regarding unregulated structures." I calmly sat in the back and let her go on. She babbled about dock erosion, unauthorized electrical work, which didn't even exist, and the danger of people slipping on wet surfaces. Then she dropped her big reveal. She held up a fake survey she claimed was conducted in the neighborhood showing residents preferred the dock be reclaimed by the HOA and dismantled due to safety concerns. Of course, none of the signatures were dated, and most were from her book club friends. Then came the vote. Karen raised her hand and gestured to her circle of loyalists, who followed suit like wind-up toys. 5 hands went up. One man, Greg, hesitated. He was the only one not hypnotized by Karen's daily muffins and backyard hot yoga. Then, just before she could declare victory, I stood up. I thanked the board for hearing my side, though they hadn't, and explained that the dock was not only on private land but that it was a designated federal resource maintained at my own expense under direct approval of the United States Coast Guard. I pulled out a folder and laid down every document. Copies of the memorandum, photographs of the dock's reinforcement work done under Coast Guard guidance, the official registry ID numbers, and a signed letter from Commander Nolan himself confirming its status. The room went quiet. Karen crossed her arms and muttered, "Anyone can print things on fancy paper. That doesn't make it law." That's when I dropped the final card. I handed out certified letters from the Regional Coast Guard Legal Office stating that any interference with the dock would be treated as obstruction under Maritime Security Code. That included unauthorized signage, attempts at demolition, or any interference with landing procedures. Karen snatched one of the letters and scanned it, her lips twitching as she tried to find something to refute. But there was nothing. It was sealed, notarized, and crystal clear. If she or the HOA touched that dock again, they would not be dealing with me. They'd be dealing with federal prosecutors. Greg, the board member who had hesitated earlier, cleared his throat. He was a retired logistics officer and had always kept a low profile. He said, "I've seen a lot of documents in my time. This is the real deal. We'd be fools to challenge it." Karen's jaw clenched. She realized she was losing control. But instead of backing off, she did what only a true HOA tyrant would do. She escalated. That night, while checking my security camera feed from the house, I caught movement at the edge of the dock. Two teenagers, one of them Karen's nephew, were trying to spray paint over the Coast Guard's official marker on the dock's woodwork. The other was fiddling with the bolts like he was trying to loosen them. I called out through the deck speaker and activated the motion sensor floodlight. They scrambled, but not before the cameras got a crystal-clear view of their faces. I recorded everything, logged the incident, and called it in to Commander Nolan as instructed. He asked for the footage and told me bluntly, "That's now considered a federal obstruction attempt. We'll be escalating this." The next day, Karen came storming down the path toward my porch, red-faced and snarling. She waved her phone in the air and shouted that I had illegally filmed minors and threatened to sue for harassment. I calmly informed her that my cameras were legally installed on private property and recorded everything that happened on my own land. And those kids? They were caught tampering with a federal resource. That's not a prank. That's a crime. She huffed and stormed away, but I could tell from the way her hand shook that she finally realized she might have pushed too far. Later that evening, a Coast Guard legal liaison personally delivered a cease and desist notice to Karen's address. He handed it to her in front of her neighbors, who watched the exchange with quiet curiosity. The notice wasn't just for her. It extended to the entire HOA board and prohibited any member from interfering with the dock or its surrounding area. Violation could lead to fines, criminal charges, and potential civil action. I didn't ask for them to go that far, but Karen had made it impossible to de-escalate. Meanwhile, word started spreading around the neighborhood. People who had kept quiet before began to talk. Apparently, Karen had also tried to find someone for hanging a small American flag, declared a child's lemonade stand a commercial venture, and even threatened a veteran with eviction over his PTSD service dog. The tide was turning. Her once loyal army of followers began to shrink. The same people who had voted with her during the emergency meeting were now avoiding her gaze. One of them even approached me privately and apologized, saying they thought she was just bluffing with the dock thing. But Karen wasn't done. She called another emergency meeting, this time with a new strategy. She claimed that since the dock couldn't be used for community purposes, it should be declared an eyesore and reported to code enforcement for removal. She even printed mock photos of the dock taken at unflattering angles, trying to make it look unstable and rotting. It was absurd. I had just repainted it last month, and the Coast Guard themselves had approved its structure for landings. This time, though, I didn't go alone. I brought with me 2 Coast Guard officers in uniform. They stood silently at the back of the room as I calmly debunked every lie Karen tried to spin. When she claimed the dock was dangerous, one of the officers stood up and said, "That dock is rated for vertical lift capacity, storm resistance, and vessel mooring. It meets federal standards." End of discussion. Karen's voice trembled as she tried to speak, but no one listened. Her voice, once loud and bossy, now sounded like background noise. It was clear the power she wielded through intimidation and deception was beginning to crumble. But even then, I knew she wouldn't go down quietly. Karen was the type who would take the whole ship down just to prove she was the captain. I left the meeting that night with mixed feelings. On one hand, I had allies now. On the other, I had a growing suspicion that she was about to make her boldest and dumbest move yet. And if I was right, the next chapter in this absurd saga wasn't going to be a vote or a flyer or a citation. It was going to be an all-out disaster. Because when you back Karen into a corner, she doesn't retreat. She explodes. And my dock was still her favorite target. 3 days passed in tense silence, the kind that didn't mean peace, just that the storm hadn't hit yet. I kept checking my cameras like clockwork, waiting for the next stunt. Karen hadn't been spotted near the dock, but her porch lights stayed on all night and she'd installed a new motion-activated sprinkler system aimed suspiciously toward my lawn. I thought maybe the cease and desist letter from the Coast Guard had finally scared her into submission, but deep down I knew better. Karen wasn't the type to retreat. She was the type to bide time, reload, and come back swinging. I just didn't know how far she'd go. Until that Saturday morning, when everything blew wide open. It started with smoke. Not metaphorical tension or HOA drama, but real thick plumes of smoke rising from the far side of the lake. I noticed it first through my kitchen window while pouring coffee. Within seconds, my phone buzzed with alerts from the community group chat. A tourist boat carrying a family of 6 had caught fire mid-lake. Someone's barbecue setup had tipped over, igniting a small gas canister. People were screaming. The boat was drifting toward the shallow cove, and the flames were climbing. This wasn't some minor HOA inconvenience. It was a full-blown emergency. And everyone in the neighborhood knew what that meant. The fastest and only safe landing point for emergency personnel was my dock. I rushed outside and unlocked the gate, pulling off the cable barrier I'd installed to keep out trespassers after Karen's nephew tried another stunt. I grabbed the emergency beacon from my shed, a bright orange panel with a built-in GPS marker, and placed it at the end of the dock. Within minutes, I could hear the hum of approaching rotors. The Coast Guard helicopter was already en route. But just as I turned to check the path behind me, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Karen and a crew of her sycophants had set up what looked like a lakeside block party, right at the base of the dock. Tents, music, tables with fruit trays and paper banners reading HOA Family Safety Day were spread across the access path like a cheerful little barricade. She saw me and smiled, waving like it was just a lovely coincidence. I yelled across the lawn, telling her to clear the area immediately, but she cupped her hands and shouted back, "It's a community celebration. We're just trying to bring people together. You can land your little boat elsewhere. It's not a runway." It wasn't just a party. She had intentionally blocked the only federally approved landing zone during an active emergency. I didn't wait. I radioed in the obstruction over the Coast Guard's civilian access channel, alerting them that the dock path was compromised. They confirmed visual contact and diverted slightly to circle while coordinating with ground unit. Seconds later, a patrol boat cut across the lake from the opposite side, headed straight for my property. On board were 2 uniformed officers and a fire rescue team. They didn't knock or ask politely. They stormed through the crowd of stunned partygoers and began tearing down the barricades without hesitation. Karen shrieked as one officer clipped her string of balloons with a rescue shears and shouted, "You can't just destroy my decorations. This is private property. The officer turned to her, ice in his voice, and said, "Ma'am, you are actively interfering with an emergency response operation. Stand back or you will be detained." It was the first time I saw her speechless. She actually backed up. Within moments, the dock was cleared and rescue efforts began. The helicopter descended low enough to deploy equipment, and the patrol boat helped tow the burned vessel to shore. The family was shaken but alive, suffering minor burns and smoke inhalation. The father, who had been trying to douse flames with bottled water, hugged the responders as if they were gods. I stood at the end of the dock, taking in the scene, but I knew my part wasn't done. Cameras mounted along the fence had caught every detail of Karen's obstruction. The tents, the banners, the screaming, and most damning of all, her telling the officer to go land somewhere else. Later that evening, as the sun set over a now quiet lake, a black SUV pulled into Karen's driveway. A man in a government-issued windbreaker stepped out, flanked by a uniformed officer. They rang her doorbell and waited. Neighbors peeked out from blinds and porch chairs like it was a live-action soap opera. She opened the door and her expression dropped the second she saw the seal on the folder in the man's hand. She tried to play polite hostess, even offered iced tea, but they didn't come for refreshments. They served her a legal notice citing her for obstruction of a federal emergency operation. Not a warning this time, a full citation with a pending court summons. Word spread fast. The community chat exploded. Screenshots of Karen arguing with the rescue team went viral. Someone edited a meme of her standing with a sign saying, "No helicopters allowed," and superimposed it on a flaming background. Even people who had been neutral in the past started to post things like, "She's gone too far," and "How can we trust the HOA after this?" But Karen wasn't done yet. That same night, she posted a long Facebook rant filled with half-baked legal theories and passive-aggressive jabs about certain individuals abusing fake federal connections. She claimed the Coast Guard had overstepped their bounds and that she would be pursuing damages for emotional distress. Comments flooded the post, most of them mocking her or correcting her inaccuracies. One even pointed out that interfering with federal responders during an active rescue could land someone in jail for years. She eventually deleted the post, but the screenshots lived on. The following morning, I received a call from Commander Nolan himself. He thanked me for my vigilance and cooperation and informed me that the legal office had begun an internal review. Karen's name had been flagged and forwarded to the Department of Homeland Security for inclusion on their local civilian interference watch list. She wouldn't be arrested, yet, but the consequences were stacking up. More importantly, the Coast Guard was returning that week to repaint the dock with more obvious federal markings, install new signage, and mount a real-time response beacon with satellite connectivity. No more room for denial. Back at the clubhouse, the atmosphere had shifted. Karen called for an emergency damage control meeting, but only a handful showed up. Most board members claimed they were sick or had family over. Greg, the only sane one left on the board, walked out halfway through her speech about biased federal enforcement. One by one, people were peeling away from her side. She blamed me in whispers, accused me of manipulating the system, and warned others that I was dangerous. But the neighborhood wasn't listening anymore. Instead, people started approaching me directly. Some offered to help repaint the dock. Others brought coffee and thanked me for protecting the community. One elderly woman who had lived there for over 40 years quietly said, "You're the first person who's ever stood up to her and made it stick. Thank you." I didn't feel like a hero. I just felt tired. But I also knew something deeper had shifted. Karen had crossed a line that couldn't be walked back. The illusion of her power had cracked. And behind that illusion, there was nothing but ego and bluster. The dock had survived. The family had been rescued. But this wasn't over. Karen didn't know how to quit. She only knew how to escalate. And if her next move was anything like I feared, it wasn't going to involve flyers or Facebook. It was going to involve courts, codes, and chaos. But now I had something she'd never understand: public support, federal backup, and a camera recording 24 hours a day. Let her try. The neighborhood felt different in the days that followed. Not just quieter, but heavier, like everyone was holding their breath. The rescue had shaken things. Seeing helicopters descend and emergency crews storm the dock had reminded people this place wasn't just some HOA-managed oasis of manicured lawns and lemonade stands. It was a real community, connected to the larger world by the same systems that protected lives. And Karen, through either arrogance or willful ignorance, had nearly gotten people killed trying to prove she could control something that was never hers. But she wasn't done. Not even close. The Karen storm wasn't over. It was regrouping, recalculating, and about to slam back with full delusion. It began with a notice, tacked to the clubhouse bulletin board and hand-delivered to mailboxes in cheap plastic sleeves. HOA members were invited to a community accountability summit, hosted by none other than Karen. The flyer's language was carefully worded to avoid anything that could be legally challenged. But the intent was clear. She was rebranding herself as a safety advocate who had been misunderstood, and was trying to frame the Coast Guard citation against her as a political witch hunt. She invited legal analysts, or so she claimed, and offered coffee and snacks as bait. Most people rolled their eyes, but curiosity won out, and nearly half the neighborhood showed up, if only to see what nonsense she'd try next. When I arrived, I stayed near the back, leaning against the wall with my arms crossed. Karen stood at the front in a crisp blouse like she was preparing to run for Congress. She started with a long speech about reclaiming community dialogue and protecting property from external overreach. She never mentioned the boat fire or the Coast Guard, just danced around it with passive phrases like recent events and procedural misunderstandings. Then she unveiled her grand solution: a motion to begin re-evaluating legacy structures within the HOA boundary for compliance reassessment, which was her new way of saying she wanted to get rid of anything she couldn't control. And right in the middle of her slideshow was a picture of my dock, blurred slightly but unmistakable. Before anyone could speak, she invited her so-called legal advisor to the front. A middle-aged man in an ill-fitting suit stepped up and began rambling about municipal authority and HOA autonomy. He tossed around terms like non-conforming assets and easement variants like confetti. But the more he spoke, the more obvious it became that he wasn't a lawyer, at least not the kind she needed. He stuttered when questioned, misquoted local statutes, and couldn't even explain the difference between public utility land and private infrastructure. Finally, someone asked directly, "Are you licensed in this state?" He dodged. Then someone else asked, "What's your field?" He admitted, in a half-mutter, that he was a bankruptcy paralegal from another county. The room shifted. You could feel the mood turning like a tide pulling back from the shore. Greg, the retired officer and board member, stood and said clearly, "I've seen more organized scams in basic training. You're selling nonsense, and you're dragging the whole neighborhood down with you." Karen's cheeks flushed. She tried to regain control by raising her voice and blaming misinformation, but it was too late. She had brought in a fraud to defend a lie, and now even her closest allies were looking at her sideways. I didn't speak. I didn't have to. The truth had its own momentum now. The very next day, Greg and 2 other board members submitted a motion to remove Karen as HOA president. They had the signatures needed, and with community support building, a formal vote was scheduled. Karen, realizing she was cornered, tried to spin it into a smear campaign. She started posting in the online neighborhood forum under fake names, praising herself and questioning the legitimacy of the board's actions. But the IP addresses betrayed her, and one of the moderators publicly outed her sock puppet account. It was like watching a dam crack in slow motion, years of built-up arrogance collapsing under the weight of her own ego. Meanwhile, the Coast Guard had returned to my dock as promised. They installed new federally issued signage with laminated warnings, satellite-synced ID numbers, and even a small encrypted device that pulsed a blue light when rescue protocols were activated nearby. It looked more official than ever. Kids passing by would stop and ask questions. Some residents even brought snacks and thanked the officers for their help. One mother whose kids had been playing near the lake the day of the fire came to me with tears in her eyes. She said, "I didn't realize how important this dock was. I do now. Thank you for not backing down." But even with the tide turning, Karen made one last desperate push. On the morning of the vote, she filed a cease and desist order through a local attorney, not against the board, but against me. She claimed I was creating a hostile environment and interfering with community management. She attached screenshots of her own failed Facebook post, blurry images from the emergency rescue as if they were evidence of abuse, and a copy of a letter she wrote to the Coast Guard demanding a full retraction of their citations. I laughed when I read it. It was a tantrum printed in legal formatting. I didn't need to fight that alone. The Coast Guard's legal team stepped in and sent an official response within hours. Her claims were baseless, and she was warned once again that further harassment or defamation could lead to formal legal action. That shut it down. For good. The vote happened that evening in the clubhouse. It was a packed house. Folding chairs were dragged from garages, and people stood in the hallway just to witness what everyone quietly hoped would be the end. Karen, red-eyed and still trying to smile, gave one last speech about dedication and vision. She claimed she only ever wanted to protect the community. Greg calmly stood after her and read the facts. The unauthorized sign, the emergency obstruction, the false legal advice, the fabricated votes, the slander, the reckless misuse of power. Then came the vote. 34 residents raised their hands. One did not. Hers. Karen was officially removed as HOA president. She stood there for a moment as if she might contest the result, but nobody made eye contact. Nobody defended her. She picked up her clipboard, muttered something about ungrateful people, and left the room. Just like that, the rain was over. Outside, I stood on my lawn watching the last bit of daylight reflect on the water. The dock looked peaceful again. Not just a piece of wood stretching over the lake, but a symbol of something bigger. A place of purpose. A place worth defending. Karen might have been removed from power, but part of me knew this wasn't her last act. People like her didn't disappear quietly. They festered. They schemed. But the difference now was that the neighborhood had woken up. The spell was broken. The whispering alliances were gone. And if she ever tried something again, she'd find herself facing not just me, but an entire community armed with truth, accountability, and a Coast Guard-approved landing zone that didn't flinch when things got serious. Let her plan. Let her file papers. Let her post passive-aggressive rants into the void. She'd already lost the only thing that ever gave her control, the illusion that no one would stand up to her. And I'd made sure that illusion was gone for good. A week after Karen's removal, the neighborhood started to breathe again. It was subtle at first. People walking their dogs actually smiled at each other. Kids rode bikes near the clubhouse without getting scolded. Someone even put up a cheerful little sign near the lake that said, "Community over control," and no one tore it down. The tension that had wrapped around every HOA meeting and bulletin board like barbed wire had finally begun to loosen. But while the residents moved on, Karen didn't. She retreated into her house like a wounded general after a failed coup, blinds drawn, porch empty, car parked rigidly in the center of her driveway as if defying the world to challenge her presence. But she wasn't idle. She was waiting, plotting, desperate for one last move to claw back her illusion of power. And true to form, she chose the most ridiculous hill to die on. It began with another letter. This time it wasn't from the HOA or the Coast Guard. It came from Karen herself, printed in thick, bold ink and wrapped in a plastic sleeve like it was sacred scripture. She claimed that since the HOA no longer recognized her authority, she was launching a new Neighborhood Preservation Committee, or NPC for short. She said the NPC was a voluntary civic group with moral oversight, designed to monitor misuse of public spaces, and she declared that the first subject of their oversight would be my dock. She even included a fine schedule and a list of made-up infractions like unauthorized paint color and non-native birds nesting nearby. At first, I thought it was a joke, but the next morning, I saw her in a reflective vest with two of her yoga friends, pacing the edge of my lawn with clipboards. They had tape measures, little orange flags, and cameras. One of them crouched near a bush, measuring some imaginary boundary line like they were prepping for a televised renovation show. I walked out onto the porch, sipping coffee, and waited for Karen to speak first. She didn't disappoint. She smiled like nothing had happened and said, "Just taking note of potential shoreline violations. Nothing personal, of course. We're all about transparency now." I asked her if she was seriously launching a shadow HOA after being ousted, and she said with a straight face, "It's not a governance body. It's a concerned citizens coalition. Completely legal." I didn't argue. I just made a phone call. Not to the Coast Guard this time, but to a local reporter I knew who had been following the dock story ever since it went viral. I told him about Karen's new group, her fake citations, and how she was stalking the lakefront with a measuring tape. He laughed so hard I thought he'd drop the phone. 2 days later, the story ran online under the headline, "HOA Queen launches fake agency after losing power, targets Coast Guard dock again." Within hours, the article was shared across every platform imaginable. The accompanying photo of Karen holding a flag next to the lake with a smug grin became the new neighborhood meme. Karen tried to spin it, of course. She posted a long Facebook rant claiming the media was twisting her words, that she had been misrepresented, that she was only trying to restore order. But no one listened. This time, people weren't just laughing, they were actively mocking her. Even her inner circle vanished. Her yoga friends quietly removed themselves from the NPC and started attending events hosted by the actual HOA. She was alone, and everyone knew it. To finally close the door on the chaos, the HOA organized a formal community event, Coast Guard Appreciation Day. It was a symbolic gesture, yes, but also a practical one. The dock had saved lives. It deserved recognition. The Coast Guard agreed to participate. On the morning of the event, a full patrol boat docked at my pier and uniformed officers greeted residents, gave safety demos, and handed out small emergency kits to families. Children took pictures in the captain's chair. Parents asked questions about boating laws. There was laughter, food, music. My dock, once the battleground of a ridiculous HOA feud, was now the centerpiece of something good. Karen watched from her window, blinds tilted just enough to reveal her face. She didn't come out. She didn't speak. She just watched. I don't know what she thought as she saw a Coast Guard officer hand a life vest to a 6-year-old, or when she saw neighbors she once scolded laughing together over hot dogs and lemonade. Maybe she felt regret. Maybe she just felt fury. Either way, she stayed silent. But one final twist was still waiting. 2 days after the event, I received an official letter from a legal office downtown. Not a threat, not a warning, an invitation. The Coast Guard had nominated my dock and property for a federal community partnership designation, something only a handful of civilian sites ever receive. It meant permanent recognition as an emergency coordination point, priority response status in times of disaster, and most notably, a small annual stipend for upkeep. I accepted immediately. It was the final nail in the coffin for Karen's crusade. The new sign arrived a week later. A sleek, professionally mounted plaque stating that the dock was now a federally endorsed emergency response site, jointly recognized by the Department of Homeland Security and the United States Coast Guard. It had an embossed seal and a QR code that led to a government registry. It couldn't be removed. It couldn't be ignored. It was permanent. The morning the sign was installed, I stood quietly at the edge of the dock, watching the crew mount it to the new steel post we'd added near the walkway. Behind me, a few neighbors gathered to take pictures and offer congratulations. Someone brought donuts. Someone else brought coffee. The air felt different, cleaner, more peaceful. Not because Karen was gone, but because her noise had finally been muted. Later that evening, I walked past Karen's house on a casual stroll. Her porch light flickered. Her lawn had gone untrimmed. The once meticulously overmanaged property now looked neglected, like even she had stopped caring. I didn't feel victorious. I just felt done. And in a strange way, I felt sorry for her. She had built her entire identity on control, managing others, policing boundaries, inventing rules. Without that illusion of power, she didn't know who she was. She had no idea how to just be a neighbor. The story eventually faded from public conversation. Life moved on. But every once in a while, I'd catch someone new staring at the dock, reading the plaque, and I'd tell them the story. Not the full version, just the highlights. A neighborhood tried to control something bigger than itself. One woman pushed too far. And in the end, the truth held firm, anchored by law, by purpose, and by a community that finally learned to push back. And Karen? She still lives there. She doesn't host meetings. She doesn't plant signs. She walks her dog once a week, nods silently at neighbors, and returns to her house like a ghost of the HOA she once ruled. She learned too late that a dock isn't just wood. And a neighborhood isn't ruled by fear. It's held together by people who care enough to protect what matters. So let her watch. Let her stew. The dock still stands. The sign still shines. And if another emergency ever comes, the Coast Guard knows exactly where to land.